Thank you for tuning into this week's episode of the Rising Laterally podcast. This is Arjun Sachdev.
And this is Jay Ballou. We hope you find something here that offers you new meaning or a fresh perspective.
If you do, we encourage you to give it life.
Be bold.
Experiment.
And most importantly, bring it into the interactions with the people you surround yourself with.
And see what happens.
Today's guest is Lisa Marchiano. Joining us from Philadelphia, Lisa is a psychotherapist, certified Jungian analyst, and co-host of the very brilliant This Jungian Life podcast. It is our pleasure to have Lisa back on the Rising Laterally podcast. We were lucky enough to sit down with her the first time in October of last year. Lisa is here today with us to talk about her newly released book, Motherhood, Facing and Finding Yourself, which explores the challenging, joyous, heroic, and sometimes maddening experience of motherhood, all through the lens of the Jungian tradition. I'm not a mother, nor will I ever be, but so much of it resonated with me, and Arjun really expanded my thinking about parenthood, family relationships, human development writ large. It's really a profound and fascinating read. We'll get into it. Lisa, thank you for being here today to discuss it with us.
Thanks for having me. It's nice to be back.
Let's start with what inspired you to write this book. What was the journey like taking it from an idea to a completed work? And perhaps we can talk about how your own experience as a mother drew you towards this topic.
Well, and I tell this story briefly in the book, but I'll give you the long version. So I was in analytic training. I was in training to become a Jungian analyst, and then I had my kids in the mix. So let's see, when my son was born, my second child was born, my daughter was 2, I had a newborn. I had been forced to take a year off of training because I just couldn't handle it with everything going on. And but I was still kind of steeping in these ideas of Jung, and I was reading Jung and thinking about Jung. So, there was just one cold December day when the kids had woken up at 4:30, as kids that age sometimes do. And I don't know, I'd stumbled out of bed and gotten them breakfast. And, by 8:00, it was like, it had already been a long day. And I was like, I've got about 12 more hours, sort of how am I going to get through the day kind of thing. So I'm like, all right, we're going to go for a walk, So even though it was freezing cold outside, I bundled everybody up, which takes forever with kids that age, and then put them in the double stroller, and I'm pushing the double stroller up the hill. And I had this really emphatic thought come into my head, like, God, everything about this is so hard. Yeah. And then the next thought that came in was really quite autonomous and surprising. This thought came up. Yes. And I'm learning so much about myself as a result. And that was immediately really interesting to me because, of course, I was, again, steeped in Jung, and Jung had this idea that we continue to grow and change throughout the life cycle. Psychological development in some schools of psychoanalytic thought, sort of you're done by 5, you're done by 12. Now we think, prefrontal cortex, 25. But Jung is one of the thinkers, not the only one, but one of them, who says, no, we continue to develop psychologically over the whole course of our lives. And he had a specific name for this. He called it individuation. Mm-hmm. And so I realized, what I'm doing is a real individuation opportunity. It's a real opportunity to grow and change and deepen and to know myself better. And I was really fascinated by that idea. And I thought, who's written about that? Most books about being a parent, or especially about being a mom, are about how to be a better mom. And the subject is really the kid.
Right.
Really, which is wonderful and valorous. I mean, I think it's good to try to be a better mom. I read a ton of parenting books in my time. But I was really curious about what is the mother's experience of motherhood? What's going on for me psychologically? How do I make sense of this experience? I started looking around for, who wrote that book, and I couldn't find it. There have been some really good books written on that subject from various perspectives, but I couldn't find one that was Jungian. There are not that many, period, but I couldn't find any that were Jungian. And so, it's not like at that second I thought, oh, I'm going to write that book. But it was something that stayed in my mind, and I was thinking about it, and it was just kind of cooking there. And of course, all this time, I'm in analytic training. I'm reading fairy tales to my kids, and I'm spending a ton of time parenting. So that was the kind of cauldron that this was cooking in for years and years.
Yeah, I think that is a really fascinating point. I mean, parents do obviously have to sacrifice a tremendous amount to provide a life for their children. And in many situations, parents have to put, the needs of and interests of their children in front of their own. But I really do like how you paint the picture of how becoming a mother and becoming a parent is a tremendous opportunity for personal growth. And I think it makes sense. People talk about that. People talk about how they, as a person, changed and how their sort of value orientation changed after becoming, a mother or a father. But no one had really, I think, explored that topic as deeply as you did, at least from what I've seen. So I really enjoyed that angle.
Yeah. And I do think, by the way, people have asked me, well, what about dads? And I do think that probably a lot of what's in my book would apply to fatherhood as well. But obviously, for personal reasons, I focused on motherhood.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say is just from my perspective as a husband and potential father, hopefully, if that miracle happens, it's like when I was reading this book, I was getting into the mindset of what it must be like to be a mother. And it just helped create this sort of empathy. Like I can now understand that, wow, mothers may end up in some of the darkest places. And it's not even if that's just like in my immediate family. It's like if I look at mothers on the street, I feel like I can better relate to them just because of what they may be going through because of reading your book, which I was really, I loved. And going back to your comment about individuation, just from your book, I thought it was great. I wanted to read it. It says, individuation is the slow process of turning into your authentic self, and that takes a lifetime. It requires you to stay open to life so that with each blow or disappointment or mistake, you befriend some new part of yourself that had been unknown or despised by you before. So it's just this way of being mindful in parenting that was eye-opening for me, because when I think of parenting, I think about, again, putting clothes on kids that takes way too long, or you're crying baby, or you're not getting enough sleep. But then if you have this mindful way of approaching it, not only is it better for the child, but it's actually better for you. And it might sound really hard to do, but it's worth doing.
Yeah. Well, one of, I wish I could quote this chapter and verse, but I can't. So I'm going to be paraphrasing, and I can't even give credit for it because I don't remember where I read it. But someone said, he was challenged to come up with one sentence that would describe Jung's thought. And the sentence that he came up with was, everything belongs. And I think that is a great phrase to take with you into being a parent, because you are going to have days when you're not perfect. You are going to have days when you're filled with rage, when you're filled with despair. And somehow, if we have this idea in our heads that there's one right way to do it, and we have to try to do it perfectly, well, we're not going to do it perfectly. And then you can wind up doing that thing that the Buddhists call suffering over your suffering. It's like, oh no, I was sad today. I don't want my kids to see me when I'm sad. So then you're sad, and then you're suffering because you're sad.
Right. Yeah.
Whereas if you say, you know what, this is just part of it. This is just part of the messiness of it. And maybe I want to try to do better, but I can also accept this. And I can even be curious about what it might teach me about myself.
And a lot of the teaching in the book and the way that the women you were helping were learning about themselves kind of refracted through the fairy tales that you wove throughout the book. You mentioned in the last episode that you're a huge fan of fairy tales. And I think after reading your book, I can definitely I have a better appreciation for their potency and how much the narrative form can be instructive as we try to better understand ourselves psychologically. I'm curious, when you were conceptualizing this book, you mentioned that fairy tales were kind of in the cauldron as you were brewing it all together. Did you know that they would have such an instrumental role in the themes throughout the book?
Yeah, I did. I guess I should say a couple things. First of all, a very important influence for me is the Jungian analyst Linda Leonard. In fact, I'm a Jungian analyst because I read one of her books.
Oh, wow.
And she has many beautiful books. And I will just admit boldly that I kind of borrowed her formula, as it were. She tends to do very much, what I've done in Motherhood, which is there's a fairy tale and there's a clinical story, and maybe there's a dream, and maybe there's a film, and maybe there's a novel, and it worked so well for me when I discovered her. It was just so it was so rich, but it was so engaging. It wasn't a struggle in any way to read this book, even though there were very profound ideas in it. But because it was all hung on narrative, it really was just such an effective way at communicating, and it just really drew me in, and I just wanted to keep reading.
Yeah.
So, I think I was very consciously borrowing her style. And then also, I really do love fairy tales. I've read a lot of fairy tales. I've always loved fairy tales. I read fairy tales even just in college, like before I went to sleep at night, instead of like reading about the Vietnam War or something. I just like read a fairy tale.
Yeah.
So they're just kind of baked into how I think. And so when this project initially was my thesis in analytic training. So there are four of the chapters in the book were my thesis.
Wow.
And I
Okay.
knew I wanted to incorporate the fairy tales in my thesis. And I remember I couldn't quite figure out how to get started. And this friend of mine and colleague, she just said, just pick a fairy tale and start.
Nice.
And I did.
Nice. Yeah. The fascinating thing about fairy tales is that there's so few frills in them. You really just get the characters, where they are, what they're doing, but you like need to get to the end of the fairy tale. As I was reading the fairy tales as you wrote them in the book, they're maybe only, 4 pages or 5 pages long, but like I would not end a chapter without finishing the fairy tale. Like I needed to know how it ended, even if it was an incredibly simple story. And I think that there's some kind of magic to them that I still can't quite put my finger on.
The magic might be, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Archon.
No, I was going to say the magic might be that it transcends different cultures and different histories and different time frames. And there's like this collective thread that we can all relate to.
Well, and what I think you're exactly right. And the Jungian language for that is they're archetypal.
Exactly.
So they're universal, and they're kind of the patrimony of humanity, as it will. Like they belong to all of us, and they come from this very deep source that we're all connected to.
Interesting. Yeah.
So they show these universal psychic patterns. They show these basic kind of psychological patterns in such a beautiful, spare way. They're a lot like dreams in a way. Dreams can have this incredible imagery, but at the same time, they tend to be very kind of economical in how they tell a story. And when you really understand a dream, which is hard to do, but when you really understand a dream, you think it's brilliance always in terms of how eloquently it gave you some insight about yourself, some really nuanced insight. And I think it takes a lot to understand a dream. It takes a lot to really understand a fairy tale too.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. A lot of just like in dreams, a lot of the objects that seem arbitrary at the first pass of a fairy tale actually has some profound metaphorical meaning if you dig into it.
exactly. You're like, that's weird. Why is he carrying a fork around, or I don't know,
Yeah,
something.
exactly.
And
Yeah.
then it's
Yeah.
like, oh, wow. And then you're right. It's exactly like that in dreams too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's a big theme throughout the book of embracing the ordinariness of life as we kind of go from the mystical world of dreams back to the more terrestrial. Maybe we can talk about the very real pain of trading the potential of our youth for an actualized adult life. And parenthood and motherhood specifically can play a large role in catalyzing that transition. So, how do you think about gracefully embracing the ordinariness of life, and what do we get in return for that if we do it well?
Yeah. Wow. That's a really big question.
Hmm.
Um, where do I want to start with that? Well, there's a way that to come into being in particular time and place, you have to sacrifice this kind of endless potential. Now,
Hmm.
you don't have to do it too early in life. I mean, I've worked with, say, I remember one young man I worked with. His girlfriend was pressuring him to settle down, and he was like, do I need to do that? And I was like, you don't, not right now. You
Yeah.
can go out and have some adventures, but at some point you have to pick one person rather than sort of holding out for, who else might I be able to date? I know that there's this book by John Fowles called The Magus, and at the end it's sort of like a boy meets girl. They get together. There's like 600 pages in between, and then they meet again at the end. Um, and I think he says to her, "Is there someone else?" And she says, "There's always someone else if you're looking."
Mm.
So,
Mm.
some of coming down into being in life is saying, "I'm choosing that. I'm choosing
Hmm.
that. I'm going to stop looking." And what it allows us to do is to have something, to be someone, to have a kind of particular personhood. There are people that really avoid this, and then they may actually get married, but they're not really committed to their marriage.
Yeah.
Um, they're always some kind of scanning the horizon for the next thing,
Yeah.
and they can be very charming people. But if you'll notice, people like that in their 30s and even 40s are often charming and a lot of fun. But late 40s, 50s, it starts to look kind of pathetic
Mm.
because what you've done is you thought you were avoiding the sacrifice. You
Right.
thought you were keeping all of the options open so that you could walk through any of the doors. And of course you can, but you did make a sacrifice.
Mm.
Because once you pick a door and walk through it, yeah, you lose the option of going through any of the other doors. But then you have this opportunity to have your own particular life. Whereas if you
Hmm.
just kind of stay in the hallway looking at all the doors, thinking, this is great, then you just sort of stay in the hallway.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
Jung talked about this, and his term for it was the puer or the puella, which is Latin for boy or girl. So it's this kind of eternal youth. It's like the Peter Pan complex. But
Right.
women can be Peter Pans too. And
Right.
so part of the point I make in the book is that sometimes there are women who don't have children because they're sort of chasing the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and they sort of never get to it. And then there are women who have children and they find that that's their opportunity to settle down,
Hmm.
to come into themselves and make those sacrifices. And then there are women who have children and don't do that too.
Yeah. And I'd love to linger on this because I think this is really fascinating dynamic, because it not only manifests in people being unable to choose life partners, but it can manifest to people being unable to choose professions or unable to settle down in one location. When you think about why people struggle to commit, I mean, what do you think is kind of like the foundational psychology underpinning that eternal boy? Is it a fear of is it a fear of missing out on something better? Is it has like a FOMO thing, or is it, a desire to stay young and to pretend that you're in a period of time where you can fantasize about your potential instead of actually reifying your life? I mean, what do you think kind of
Well,
drives that?
I think all of those things. I think you could also talk about it as an inability or a failure to mourn.
Mm.
There's a way that we can't really be alive unless we can grieve,
Mm.
because anything we get comes at a cost. There's always a loss. Every new thing you get, you lose something. And we don't think about it like that in our culture. We think we can have something and there's no downside, but there's always something we give up. So, obviously if you get married, you lose that freedom and you lose the potential to possibly marry other people. If you have kids, you have kids, but boy, you lose a lot of freedom. You lose, some of your youth. You lose, there's all kinds of costs, but we don't like to think about that. And
Yeah, because
so, sorry, go ahead, Arjun.
oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No.
I was going to say, because many of us don't want to face our shadow. And that's like when I was reading your book, I was constantly reminded of this idea of finding purpose in, I'm about to be 35. So from now for the next 35 years, finding purpose in the second half of my life means having my own set of values, my own inner authority, my own way of like reviewing my behavior. And it just comes down to, are you willing to get down and dirty with your shadow? Are you willing to get down and dirty with the parts that you've been pushing aside for so long? Because at the end of the day, going back to one of the original things we were talking about, is if we're all on a quest to find our authentic self, we have to get dirty.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. Absolutely. Yeah, there is a way that the Peter Pan type kind of just stays above it all in this magical space.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that is a great segue into a discussion of the shadow. One of the parts I really liked about your book, one of the parts I really liked in your book was the discussion of emotions that mothers can sometimes have for their children that in modern times have heavily been relegated to the shadow. And two of the big ones were anger, rage, and disgust. I mean, how often do we talk about mothers feeling disgust for their children? Hardly ever. Can you talk about the process of drawing these emotions up out of the shadow and what it looks like to healthily integrate them into your relationship with your children?
Yeah. I think that it's probably very common to feel disgust or disgusted with your kids at various points. And again, not something that most women want to admit.
Mm-hmm.
And when we're in the realm of disgust, we're somewhere close to shame. So perhaps our kids have done something that make us feel ashamed, or we're ashamed of how we've been with our kids, or we're ashamed of our kids. It happens.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's another reason why we don't want to talk about it. Not only do we feel terrible for feeling disgust, but the thing that made us disgusted is something we may not want to reveal. So it can be a very lonely, isolating feeling to have.
Mm-hmm.
I think, again, going back to my almost sort of central premise, back to everything belongs. If we can give ourselves permission to say, oh God, I'm feeling disgust. I wonder what that's about.
Mm-hmm.
What is the message? What is the messenger of disgust here to tell me today?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I think it often is about, and what I explore in the book, is that we're projecting parts of ourselves that we're disgusted by onto our kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's probably usually what it's about when we feel disgusted at our kids.
Yeah. Yeah. You had mentioned, I think, one anecdote where a mother was not at all in touch with her aggression, and her daughter pushed your daughter when the mother was out of view. And, you brought this to her attention, and she says, well, my daughter doesn't push. And as a result of the mother pushing that aggression into her shadow, it didn't give her daughter a healthy outlet to learn how to deal with her own aggression. So you kind of keep passing down whatever's in the shadow of the parent can be passed down to the child generation after generation. You can get these massive patterns.
Yes. I mean, Jung said that the greatest influence on the psyche of a child is the unlived life of the parent.
Mm.
Yeah, because it's like, I was wondering, how do you help a mother who has a child and then has to be forced with confronting situations that they were never able to get over or they never had to go through? So how do you parent a child through that if you never had your own closure, or you never resolved that particular thing yourself?
Well, and of course, that happens all the time. These old unresolved conflicts that come up when we have kids, which is one of the reasons why I think parenthood can be a tremendous crucible for learning about ourselves, because we will face those are exactly the conflicts that are going to come up. And the good news is that experiencing these conflicts again with our kids will give us a new chance to resolve them.
Yeah,
Mhm.
So it can be really healing.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think Marion Woodman had that idea of the spiral. Like you might face something in one part of your life and it seems like it's out of you and you won't have to deal with it again, but you'll come back around and experience it in another way. And in a sense, it's a blessing because maybe at first it doesn't seem like a blessing, but it gives you an opportunity to revisit that unresolved issue from the past and again, further your own individuation.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, there's a fairy tale that didn't make it into the book. Actually, there's sort of a pair of fairy tales from the American South. One is called The Witches, and these two kids are left alone and they're hungry, and the parents are gone. We don't know where they are, and the kids wind up getting sort of attacked by these witches, and they're about to get eaten, and they get saved in the end by the dogs. But it's this real image, I think, of kind of intergenerational trauma, and how the parents were not able to overcome their trauma, and it kind of gets passed along to the kids who are left kind of defenseless. And then there's this other fairy tale also from the American South, so charming. It's called Wiley and the Hairy Man.
Hmm.
And just to quickly describe it, Wiley's father was killed by the hairy man. And so his mother always says, you be careful. And he always takes his dogs out with him. But then one day he leaves his dog at home by accident, and the hairy man comes and is going to take him, but he's wily enough to trick him. But the hairy man kind of keeps on after him. And the denouement of the story is that Wiley's mother is able to help him trick the hairy man for the third time, which means you've vanquished him.
Oh, interesting.
And there's this lovely scene where they're working together to trick the hairy man. And, to me, that's like, okay, so the father faced this challenge and was not able to meet it. Then a generation later, the same conflict comes up, and the mother is able to help her son manage that challenge. So I think it can be a healing opportunity when these old things come up.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think first it starts with becoming conscious of them. That was another thing that you hit on in the book, that that's this idea of like before you can actually work through it, you have to draw it up out of the shadow into your consciousness. And the one thing that has really been kind of messing with my mind about the shadow is like the whole point is that you're not conscious of it. If you're like, oh, that's in my shadow, it's like, well, you really don't actually know what's in your shadow. And when it comes out, it's usually an extremely intense experience, not like an intellectual exercise, like it knocks you on your ass.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I think those moments where you have the opportunity to revisit something from your past or your parents' past are usually when you first encounter them, you really don't know what to do with them. You're like encountering that hairy man for the first time, and you don't know how it's going to unfold, and you usually feel pretty vulnerable.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Just on the nature of the shadow, I know the Jungian analyst Jim Hollis will sometimes say, if you're wondering what your shadow is, ask your spouse.
Oh, wow. I like that. Yeah, we actually had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Hollis earlier in the year. So he's a wonderful man. It
He's
was really a joy
amazing.
speaking with
Yeah.
him.
There's a couple of quotes from your book, though, if we're talking about shadows, that I wanted to actually read because I think they're important. So if we're talking about shadows, and earlier you were talking about projecting on children. So a couple of quotes. The first one is, if there's anything that we wish to change in our children, we should first examine it and see whether it is not something that could better be changed in ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Right. The other one was, if we have children, we will inevitably project our worst qualities onto them. All parents at one time or another see the most despised parts of themselves carried by their children. If we can stay in relationship with our children when this happens, we will have the opportunity to get to know and accept the least likable parts of ourselves, the parts that Jung referred to as our shadow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that's true as far as I can see, that the opportunity there is that, like, when you have those moments of disgust at your kid, like, I can't believe, it's like, oh, okay, so where is that in me?
Yeah.
Right.
And,
Right.
and can I, because we tend to really love our children. So even when we're enraged or disgusted, we still can feel that compassion for them, that empathy for them that we often can't give to ourselves.
Yeah, I had a friend. I was really interested in this concept of having anger towards your children, and so it sometimes can manifest in rage or wrath. And this example is as a father, not a mother, but I think it kind of applies. I had a friend whose dad was just like a genuinely angry man. Like when I was over there, even with me there, we would be playing in his bedroom, and I could hear his dad screaming at his sister and screaming at his mother, and it was just constant. I knew the second I left the house, my friend was definitely going to be on the receiving end of that
Oh,
wrath as
God.
well, and he suffered as a result of that dynamic. But you also make the case that it getting that aggression out can actually advance the relationship with your children if you go through a period of repair afterward. Can you talk about a healthy way of releasing that anger and how to actually use it to sustain the relationship?
It's so hard because anger is just messy. It just is. And it's never pretty, and it's never just right. It always feels dangerous a little bit. It always feels hot.
Yeah.
Um, but, and it's interesting because if you, if you Google something like, you know, is it damaging to yell at your kids or something? You will get lots and lots of hits of research papers that say it's bad to yell at your kids, which seems like, a perfectly obvious finding. And yet, I mean, when my kids were little, like they're toddlers, did a day go by that I didn't yell at them? I mean, maybe a day, but a week, probably not. And I don't think that's just me. Don't think that's just me. So, and I did sort of, test that hypothesis against, with a little bit of internet searching, but on mothers forums or something, there used to be this, I don't know if it's still there. There used to be this forum on Mothering Magazine hosted it. And the word rage just returned like, I don't know, 400,000
Oh, wow.
posts or something like
Wow.
that. So I think that it's a very, very common thing. I mean, I know it is. I know it's a very common thing that people yell at their kids, even people who say, I don't want to yell at my kid. So there's a way that I think, well, if it's that hard not to do it and it's that normal, then it's probably not that bad. Now, I don't think that parents should give themselves a pass and say, oh, it's fine for me to yell at my kid. I know that I tried every single day not to yell at my kids. I really tried, and I tried different things, and I read different books, and I tried different techniques. And it was not an easy thing to not do. And I do think it's worth trying not to do it, and to wondering about when it happens, to wonder what happened, why did I do that? What was I feeling? Okay, I was tired. Okay, I was, this, that, or the other thing. Um, but also I was curious about what's really going on when we get angry at our kids, and what
Mm.
might some of the positive things be. And clearly there's a real positive side to anger, and I explore that in the book. Just anger, period. Being able to get angry, being able to access your anger. It's very important, actually, when you're parenting, because anger helps us protect ourselves, and so it helps us protect our kids too.
Mm.
But when we get angry at our kids, are there is there something there going on that maybe is not quite so bad? And I think, as I say in the book, I think some of it is that anger is very authentic.
Yeah.
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 You know exactly how you feel when you're angry, and you know what? When someone's angry at you, you know exactly how they feel.
Yeah.
And I think there's something really healthy about creating space for that in the relationship.
Mm.
I remember one time, my son, when he was little, I don't know, I wouldn't like give him a cookie or something. And he screamed really loudly, "I hate you." And he was being a big pain in the ass. And I said, "Well, you know what? I hate you too right now." And there's something about just being able to find that in the other person, that
Mm.
it's like, you're real with the other
Yeah.
person.
Yeah.
There's emotions flowing. It's great.
There's emotions flowing. Exactly. And they're authentic.
Yeah.
And so I do think that, when you've really kind of lost it on your kid, that repair is really important. And this is kind of backed up by lots of research. So, I would always kind of wait until I'd cool down. And then I'd try to do this introspective thing about what was going on for me when that happened. I'd try to at least understand for me what happened. Um, and it didn't, like I said, it wasn't like it was some magic bullet that meant I didn't do it again. But
Right.
I tried to gain insight about it, and then I would apologize. I'm sorry I yelled. I shouldn't have done that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that you're modeling, one of the many things that's getting modeled is that people can get angry with each other and still love each other and still be in connection with each other.
Yeah, for sure.
That's a great lesson for a child to actually see and witness, because if things go unresolved, then they're going to never know how to resolve things. And, when they're in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, they will end up in situations where there's rage and anger, but there's no resolution. It's like kind of just shoved under the rug.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, and I feel like the way that the child can learn how to express it healthily, the critical piece there is them also having space to be angry at their parent. Like, it's, if you have a parent who is kind of playing the role of the tyrannical queen or the tyrannical king, and they're raining down this wrath on their kid, but then when it comes the other way, it's like totally unacceptable. Then you have a one-way dynamic, which can really press that aggression even like further into the child's shadow, I would imagine.
That's a really great point. That's a really great point. I think you're absolutely right. And I think there is something really healthy about creating some space for your kid to be mad at you, at the same time that you have to also convey that, uh, that you can't just treat someone like a punching bag. It's like, I get angry at you. Sometimes I do things I wish I hadn't done, or I say things I wish I hadn't said. I'm going to try to do better. It matters to me how I treat you. You're going to get angry at me. You're going to lose control. This sounds really unromantic, but in terms of parenting, I think a lot of what we're doing is teaching affect regulation.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what that means?
Yeah, I mean, so affect regulation is this sort of psychobabble term, but it just means, can you can you deal with your emotions constructively? Which means,
Hmm.
can you not avoid them? A lot of people avoid emotions.
Yeah.
And I think this discussion about anger is kind of in that realm, that some people that are sort of too nice, or that bury the anger, then the anger is getting avoided. That's not
Right.
good. You want to be able to have the feeling, like sort of move through it, and then sort of feel it all the way and then come out the other side.
Mm.
So I think, in some way, emotions are like those summer thunderstorms which we're having one now. I don't know if you've heard the thunder in the background, but they roll through and,
Right.
there's all this bluster and the trees are blowing, the rain's coming down, the thunder and the lightning, and then they're gone and the air feels cool and refreshing. And,
Yeah, right.
it's sort of like that. So whether it's anger or sadness or fear, these core emotions that really arise from bodily states, it's healthy to be able to feel them. So we don't want to repress them, but we also don't want to ruminate on them, sort of get stuck on them in a loop. And we don't want to act out too much. Sometimes you have to do something when you're feeling afraid, or you have to do something when you're feeling sad, or you do something when you're feeling angry. But if when you're angry, you're just pummeling your kids like your friend's dad, you're not getting through it then either.
Oh, yeah, right.
So, this is affect regulation is really important for mental health, basically. So teaching kids how to regulate themselves a little bit, okay, you're angry. It's okay to be angry. And it's not okay to make everyone in the house angry.
Right.
You can't have this little storm that's going to upset everyone. So be angry, tell me about your anger, and then if you still need to be angry, then you need to go do that in your room.
Right. Right.
So, but that there's some permission in the family environment for feelings to happen.
Absolutely.
Interesting, because some of those feelings of rage or anger, again, this is what I gathered from your book, was that if you're a parent and you grew up without having much self-worth, or if you always felt like you were inadequate, then any sort of underachievement by your child, you might just get angry at them for that.
Absolutely.
And so going back to the mental health of just finding your self-worth and how important that is, if you can't find your own self-worth, then it's going to be hard for you to be able to regulate the emotions in the household.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, I think if you're in that environment, the first thing is kind of get curious about what's actually making you angry and how much of it is your own disappointment in yourself, which happens all the time.
Absolutely. Well, one big topic I wanted to talk about, which a lot of, I think, subtopics are probably going to finger out of, was the idea of maternal instinct. We live in a culture now that seems to emphasize productivity and career. It doesn't seem to place much value on a woman's internal call to get pregnant and to have a child. And I wanted to ask you, why do you think we've come to see, I know it's a big question, but we've come to see the maternal instinct as a sort of lowly impulse instead of this magical generative force that really underpins life itself, which it is.
Yeah. That is a really, really big question. I mean, I'm aware that there's a certain discourse around, I think they call themselves the antinatalists.
Yep.
That you shouldn't have children. And it's, it's not that I can't see some of the points. I mean, our planet is in trouble, and, having fewer people on it might be a good thing. But there's something sort of so essentially nihilistic about saying it's, this is a bad idea. I get not everyone's going to choose parenthood. That's fine. But as a kind of more than just a personal decision, more of almost a kind of ideological belief that people shouldn't have children. It feels very, very nihilistic to me. And it does feel, to pick up on what you were saying, like we're really cut off from instinct. And I think that as a culture we are. Jung says, I wish I could snap this quote out perfectly, but he said something like, the cause of most of our troubles is that we're cut off from instinct. He said that, in different ways, again and again and again. And, instincts are authentic. People say, well, what's authenticity? As far as I can tell, authenticity has to do with, are you sort of in touch with your instincts? And we devalue the feminine in our culture. We devalue the body. We devalue that which is non-rational.
Yeah.
And all of these things are in the same kind of neighborhood. And,
Right.
so there's an instinct to have kids. I do believe that there is, for men and for women, by the way. And then I think that there are instincts that come online when you have kids. They're really powerful. You do really feel differently about things after you have a kid. And some of what happens between you and your kid is just very instinctive. The way, just for example, researchers have studied what they call motherese, because mothers in every culture will speak to their babies in these sing-song voices.
Interesting.
So linguists have looked at that and studied it, and it's kind of built in.
Interesting. That's fascinating.
What else seems to be built in is this idea that like a mom needs to always take care of their child, but at the same time has to let them live a full life as well. So that idea of balancing their kid being able to live a full life, but also taking care of them, but not having to always influence them. I feel like that is something that's kind of built into us as a mom and the mom's responsibility is to be able to separate that at some point in their life.
Yeah. You have an instinct to kick them out of the nest. You have an instinct to separate from them a little bit and say, okay, even if it's just sort of happening under the threshold of consciousness, it's like you can feel that the ties that bind you are different. They're still there, but they're a lot looser and longer. So so you asked, why do I think that's been devalued? I actually think a really interesting way to look at this is through the lens of Iain McGilchrist's work, The Master and His Emissary, which I know if you listen to This Jungian Life, you're probably like, oh my God, I can't believe she's bringing that book up again, because I bring it up all the time.
You actually brought it up on our last episode. I still got to read it. No,
Oh
no,
my
I'm
God.
going to actually read it. Yeah.
It's like, it's a tome, and it's talk about like books that are work, but it's rewards you. Actually, you know what I'll tell you, because it was so influential and important and popular, there is a version of the book that's like 50 pages or something like that. It's very short.
Oh,
and
between us.
it includes all of the ideas. It just doesn't include all the research, because it's just chock full with all of this split brain research and all of this philosophy and stuff. But you can get the ideas by reading the short book. But he really is looking at hemispheric differences in the brain and speculating about why that would be. Like, why did evolution give, I think it's most all vertebrates, bihemispheric brain, in which clearly the hemispheres are specialized.
Yep.
And, I think that the kind of left hemisphere, according to McGilchrist, I'm going to try to paraphrase this here or summarize it. The left hemisphere is very interested in instrumentalizing things. It sees things out of context. It's very good at kind of putting things in groups and noticing the similarities between things in that group. And it's McGilchrist says, it's sort of the part of the brain that helps you figure out what to eat. Whereas the right hemisphere brain has this kind of open attention that notices everything, that sees it in context, that is much more kind of holistic in its experience that it creates. And the title, The Master and His Emissary, comes from the idea that the right brain is the master and the left brain is the emissary. And the emissary has betrayed the master, because we live in a culture that's heavily, heavily, heavily left brain. And he makes this point very convincingly, I think, in the second half of the book. So a lot of the things that we're talking about when we talk about instinct and embodiment and non-rationality and things that are implicit rather than explicit, things that you just feel, or or you have an intuition about. or you're listening to your body say, I don't want to go back to work. I want to stay home with this baby, rather than, well, I've seen the bank account. I need to go back to work.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of I'm wanting to say it's a little bit of the difference between the hemispheres. And there's a way that our culture is just sort of pretty out of balance in the left hemisphere.
Yeah. And I think, to kind of riff on that, I'm probably going to get a little over my skis here, but I think that there's something that's like the instinctual complexity of women seems to be more pronounced than men, in the sense that, a woman can actually create a child inside of them. Like the womb is a lot more complicated than what men have going on in that area. And I think, to that point about us sort of divorcing ourselves from instinct and kind of casting it out as a sort of lowly part of life, and even thinking about something like high society, you think about like novels and prose and music, or what's considered high music. The very fact that we call that high society, as if it's like on some hierarchy above things like physical connection, I think we've really kind of cast the body out as a sort of gross thing.
Mm-hmm.
Even when I think about like the pregnancy, the movies that it's been featured in that I've seen have been horror movies. I think about like Rosemary's Baby or that Mother movie that featured Jennifer Lawrence. Like there's no real, we don't celebrate it as something beautiful. We see it as sort of horror show. And I think that's just if reflective of the way that we've cast the body out into the shadow.
Mm-hmm. I think that you're mining the same vein, and there is a way that it's much. I mean, I think women are more connected with their bodies than men are. I mean, not every single person, but as a general rule, it's much harder for women to dissociate themselves entirely from their body, because we've just got a lot going on all the time, and inexperiences like menstruation or pregnancy, and so I do think that some of these, what I'm calling kind of right-brained things, do tend to be more associated with, I'm going to call it the feminine.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not making a claim here that women are not rational. That's not what I'm saying, but that it may be that either for reasons that I don't quite understand, I think women may have more access to that more easily as a general rule. And so it's interesting that that's also what gets kind of devalued.
Yeah, very interesting. And what do you think society's relation? I know it's not really covered in the book, but I've been thinking about the ways that society has a relationship with the maiden, the idea of like the young woman, versus the way that society has a relationship, at least in terms of how it manifests in popular culture, with the archetype of the mother, or even the archetype of the wise old woman. It seems like there's so much emphasis on the maiden, so much value put there, but and arguably in some senses more profound archetypes of motherhood and of wisdom in women's older ages, that kind of gets completely left out of our cultural narrative right now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that, and that's always been true, right? I mean, it was the old women who were burned as witches throughout most of history. So there's something that women, and perhaps older women, carry that feels threatening to the dominant culture a lot of the times. And it may be that it's more of this embodied kind of wisdom and instinctuality that culture just needs to kind of keep at arm's length or something.
So then, to that point, how do you talk to some of the clients in your practice about a new mother who is now dealing with a mother-in-law who feels like they know everything when it comes to parenting? How should someone balance that relationship?
That is, surprisingly common, that scenario. And yeah, I've definitely seen that. I mean, I think that, and there's some great fairy tales about that too.
Yeah. Many of which are in your book.
Yeah. I'm thinking of this one from India that's just like, oh my God, that didn't make it into the book. But I mean, honestly, it's about claiming authority.
Oh yeah.
Because that, and when the baby comes along, that is a time when there's often a kind of a clash an authority clash between, because that's the thing. The mother brings home the baby, and that mother knows that baby better than anyone in the world. And that mother has to have authority over that baby and be able to trust herself. And so if there's anyone, whether it's a mother-in-law or her mother or, anyone, I mean, honestly, another thing that comes between a mother and her baby often are these kind of cultural fads. I know one woman in my practice who recently became a mother was telling me about these Instagram cultures about baby sleep training methods that just sound like completely barbaric. I couldn't believe some of the stuff she was telling me. These books are very popular now, apparently, about sleep training your very young child. And, if that feels right to a woman, great, go ahead, But if that doesn't feel right, I think a woman should be able to claim her own authority in what she knows and be able to say, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that thing. I'm going to find something else that works for me.
Yeah.
So if it's a particularly young mother or a woman, maybe who's not so young, but just hasn't really grown into her authority, that will be an opportunity to do that. Just set a limit and say, to the mother-in-law, sorry, I am going to breastfeed, even though you don't think I should, or whatever.
Yeah.
My
Just
baby.
stand up for yourself. Yeah.
Yeah.
And zeroing in on that relationship between mother and infant, I really like the chapter in your book where you talk about motherhood as a opportunity for transcendence and for spiritual connection, both with your child and sort of the universe as a whole. Can you talk about how having a child can ground you in the circle of life and connect you with the infinite? Because I thought it was just a fascinating idea that you expound on in the book.
Yeah, thanks. I liked that chapter.
Yeah.
I loved it too. Can't lie. That was my favorite stuff. Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Good.
Yeah.
I think it's mine too. I was like, oh yeah, that turned out so well. Yeah, because I think you just sort of said it. It does kind of ground you in the circle of life in a way. It makes you feel connected to all of the mothers who came before you, and then you clearly can see yourself kind of. You can project yourself into the future through your children. And, I can remember some moments of just like looking at my daughter when she was really little and just kind of being able to feel that sort of, I don't know, wheel of time thing or something that, I had a mother and, she had me and now I have a daughter and maybe someday she'll have a daughter, and I'm just sort of part of this. And that is a kind of dizzying feeling when of course we all know that.
Yeah.
But to really experience, it's like, wow.
Yeah.
It's like stepping up to the edge of the Grand Canyon and going, wow, look,
Yeah.
So that was part of it, is just that it also can connect you with a sense of purpose. It can, as one of you just mentioned, it kind of shifts your values. I think for a lot of women, it shifts their values in a way that, they're interested in doing something that is less insular or just kind of focused on them, even in terms of things outside of parenthood, what they might decide to do. They might make a career shift because that thing that I used to do, it just doesn't matter as much anymore. I want to do something that really matters to me.
Right.
Yeah, just that it's so powerful too, I think, to feel time move forward in a different way. And so maybe part of it is that it really, and maybe this is more true for women than men, but I think it really kicks up your experience of your own mortality. Because it's like when I was, I don't know, between 30 and 35, like I did not think I aged at all. Like, it was just 5 years. Like, but then when I had kids, like between like 35 and 40, so I'd gone from like having a newborn to like a kid who was reading. It was like, well, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
So it's like, wow, no, 5 years is a long time.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
You know what? And another dizzying thought from your book was, this is something I think that can connect all of us, is when you think about the moment from going from a hypothetical to alive and squirming. When I read that in your book, I'm like, this is profound stuff. I love that, because just that idea that even if, you're about to come out, you're still hypothetical at that situation, at that point. From that moment to the point where you're screaming and alive, I think was one of those things where it's like, we all went through that.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're all
Yeah.
connected.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It does. It does make you feel connected. It
Yeah,
does really make you
absolutely.
feel connected.
And I think, and parcel of that, we've been like in this chain of viviparous creatures that are producing children through their own bodies, going all the way back to our time in the ocean, and the life forms we were there came literally out of the ground of the earth. And so it connects you in the human chain, but on a spiritual level, it also connects you right back to the origin of life itself. And
Mm-hmm.
it's totally natural. There's nothing, there's no dogma in there. There's no the religion you have to subscribe to feel that spiritual connection with the origins of life, which is,
Yeah.
I think, really profound.
Yeah, that's really well said. I hadn't thought about it exactly like that, but I think that's a really good point. Yeah, you feel like you're an animal like any other.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
something comforting about that.
Yes. Well, the book is Motherhood. It was an incredible read. Really, there was so much in it that we didn't cover. Now hearing the story that you came out of your thesis, it's been something you've been working on for such a long time. It makes me appreciate it even more. And it makes sense because I can tell that the ideas in that book have been crafted over time. There's just a potency to them that I got a lot out of. And I know potential mothers out there or women that have already experienced motherhood will get a lot out of it as well. So really, thank you for writing the book, and thank you for being with us here today, Lisa.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation. I always like talking to you guys.
Awesome.
Wonderful.
Thanks.
Take care.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can sign up for the Rising Weekly newsletter sent out each week.
Every Friday, we expand on the episode with insights, recommendations, and more.
You can sign up at risinglatterly.com.
Thank you.